Welcome to our cooking class. We're going to be cooking with pumpkins. Right now is the time of year in Alberta, anyways, when pumpkins are ready to be harvested. You start to see pumpkins now popping up in grocery stores, popping up on people's front steps, and people are going to be carving fun faces into them and baking with them. So if you want to take a second now and go preheat your oven, the oven needs to be preheated to 400 degrees Fahrenheit. We'll start talking about some housekeeping items for cooking in the kitchen. First thing, and one of the most important things, is you want to make sure your hair is tied back so it's out of your face, out of your way. It's not going to be getting in front of you while you're cooking. Make sure your clothing's not too loose or flying around. So if you have any big sweaters or jackets, just feel free to take them off and put them to the side. If you have an apron, that's great for keeping your clothes clean and not too dirty. And then the one safety concern, be careful near the oven. It's very hot, so don't go sticking your hands into it. You might need a bit of supervision. That'll help you out. And then lastly, keep your workspace clean as you go. The next housekeeping item we'll go in is just kind of orienting yourself with your kitchen space. So it's really handy while you're cooking if you have everything in front of you. So I have all my bowls in front of me. I have my measuring utensils, and then I have my ingredients off to the side. That just makes it quick and easy to grab things as you go and avoids any confusion. Let's start talking about the recipe a bit. So we're going to need flour, sugar, baking powder, salt, pumpkin spice, unsalted butter, 1 egg, cream, pumpkin puree, and vanilla extract. All right, so first step, preheat the oven. We've already done that. We're good to go. So the next part of the first step is to line 1 or 2 large baking sheets with parchment paper. So since this recipe makes 8 scones, you probably will only need to line 1, but it might be good to have 2 just in case. So I've already lined mine. If you want to take a second to line your baking sheet, and then we're just going to put them off to the side because we don't need them yet, but it's nice to have them prepared. So next thing you'll need is a large bowl. So if you want to grab out your large bowl. Okay, so in a large bowl, combine the flour, sugar, baking powder, salt, and pumpkin pie spice. We're going to take our 1 cup measuring utensil. We'll put it in the bowl, or in the bag, and don't pack it in too tightly, so you want it loosely in the measuring cup. And then you can level it off with your finger, as long as it's not going to be too messy. And then dump it in the bowl. And we'll do that 2 times. Level it off and dump it in. So we got our 2 cups of flour. We need 1/3 a cup of sugar. And so remember, trying to keep your workspace as clean as possible. So we can put the flour off to the side because we don't need it again. We need 1/3 a cup of sugar. And sugar is great for scones because it adds a bit of sweetness. So we have 1/3 of a cup in this recipe, but if you wanted to add a little bit less, feel free. You can add 1 to 2 tablespoons. I'm going to go with 1/3 of a cup because we're following the recipe. And we can also put the sugar off to the side. And we won't be needing that again, so we're all done with it. So we have flour, sugar, so now we need 1 tablespoon of baking powder. And baking powder is used in these scones anyways because it's a leavening agent, which means it adds lift to the scones, so it allows them to rise, rather than them coming out and turning out dense and flat. It gives them some volume. So we'll put 1 tablespoon of baking powder. Then we'll move that off to the side, keeping our workspace clean. And then we need 1/4 teaspoon of salt. So if you want to find your 1/4 teaspoon, and if you don't have 1/4 teaspoon, because sometimes these can be a little tricky to find or they're easy to lose, you can even just put a pinch of salt in. It doesn't have to be very much. And then the last ingredient we need is 2 teaspoons of pumpkin pie spice. So if you want to grab your pumpkin pie spice, and then grab your teaspoon, I'm going to put 2 of those. And this is going to add a lot of flavor. We'll also be adding pumpkin, which will give a real strong pumpkin taste, and you'll be able to smell it everywhere as it's baking, which is very nice. But the pumpkin pie spice has a lot of different spices, so it does have some cinnamon and some nutmeg, and it just gives them a lot of flavor. And it adds a lot of good smells. All right, so if you have all your dry ingredients in here, now we're just gonna give them a mix. So just making sure that everything's stirred together. You can use a wooden mixing spoon. Just make sure that everything's nice and mixed up. So we're on number 3 on the instruction list, if you're following along with the recipe. So the next one is to cut the butter into cubes and add it to the mixture. And then you can combine it with a pastry cutter, 2 forks, or with your fingers. I'm gonna be using my fingers. It's kind of the best way to pinch up the butter, makes it super easy to mix everything. And the mixture should be crumbly and be pea-sized. Let's start with 1/2 cup of unsalted butter. So if everyone wants to grab their butter, and if, like me, you have a block of butter, not always, but sometimes these have measurements on the side. So this here that I have is a cup. It's about half of what the stick usually is, and we need 1/2 cup. So I'm actually just gonna cut this right in half, and that's all we'll do to start. The butter gives flavor, it adds texture to the scones. It makes them delicious, really. We like it cold because this is just like in a pastry. It's not like in a cookie where you soften the butter and you cream it, and it gives it a bit of a different texture. So we're going to be using it cold. What we're going to do with the butter is we're going to cut it into cubes. So when we cut it into cubes and then we add it to the flour mixture, it makes it a little bit easier to get the pea-sized chunks, or whatever size chunks. They can be bigger than peas too, that's totally fine. All right, so we're gonna take it and cut it into little cubes. All right, then we're gonna add it to the mixture. So actually bring your dry ingredients back, and when you're ready, take all your butter cubes, however they may look, it doesn't matter, and you can just drop it in. So the butter is in with the flour. You can smell all the pumpkin pie spices. They smell very fall-like. And just crumble it up. And make sure when you're doing this to kind of scoop from the bottom. So try to get all the flour. So it's easy to kind of just maybe mush the butter in the middle, but try to scoop up from the sides and incorporate all the flour. The butter isn't going to be making this wet. It's kind of just going to be sitting in the flour. So don't expect it to be everywhere. It's just going to be like little chunks of butter within your flour, and it's going to make the scones delicious. And it's going to add a lot of flaky texture. All right. Just remember, it's probably better to err on the side of caution and leave bigger chunks rather than smaller chunks, because it's always easier to go back and make them smaller, but once they're small, you can't put them back together. So we're going to be moving on after this to step number 4. And then we'll take our small bowl and we're going to mix the wet ingredients. So that's going to be the egg, cream, pumpkin puree, and vanilla extract. And so before we do that, you might need to take a second to wash your hands, put your bowl off to the side. I have flour and butter all over my hands, so I'm going to take a second and wash them off. So first we need the egg. So I'm going to grab 1 egg, open the shell, drop the egg in, and then we'll just be throwing out the egg shell. So if you want to go ahead and do that, sometimes the edge of the bowl might not be hard enough to break the shell. It might make it a little bit difficult. And then a food safety tip, if you have raw egg on your hands, I would go wash them, give them a good scrub with soap, just because we don't want this, that raw egg getting everywhere, because that could make you sick. But the raw egg will be okay in the scones because it will be baked. All right, and if you have cracked your egg in and you have all the raw egg off your hands, let's see what else we need. In this bowl, we're also going to put the cream, pumpkin puree, and vanilla. So I'm going to go grab those things and line them all up in front of me. All right, we need 1/2 cup of cream, 1/2 cup of pumpkin puree, and 2 teaspoons of vanilla. So I'm going to grab my 1/2 cup measuring cup. And opening my cream, and let's add that in. So that's half a cup of cream. So using cream really helps leaven the scones, so it helps them to rise, and it adds a lot of flavor. It makes them very delicious. So I'm just gonna put my cream over to the side for now. And then we'll need half a cup of pumpkin puree. So I have my can here. I've already opened it. So you might need to take a second and grab a can opener and open up your can. And then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna grab a spoon and just scoop it out into the half a cup measuring cup. And we'll just be putting little scoops in. And unlike the flour, which we didn't want to pack down, we'll be packing this down into the measuring cup because we want as much as possible. Making sure not to put too much because this is a wet ingredient and we don't want to make our scones too wet. Maybe take a second now and add your half a cup in. And I'll give you a few seconds to do that. If you've used a teaspoon versus a tablespoon before, the difference is you can tell by what's written right on the measuring utensil. So a teaspoon, it's abbreviated as TSP, and a tablespoon on this one is TBS. So a tablespoon is a lot bigger than a teaspoon. And we're only using a little bit of vanilla. We just want to add a little bit of extra flavor. So we'll be using 2 teaspoons. If you want to grab your vanilla, and we'll add it in. Just 1 teaspoon and 2. And really the function of the vanilla is just to add some flavor. So if you aren't a fan of the flavor of vanilla, you can add less. You can add a little bit more if you want. I wouldn't add too much more because again, you don't want it to overpower the dry ingredients. And then I'll just throw my vanilla off to the side. And now, depending where you are on this step, you can grab your whisk and start whisking the ingredients together. And we'll do this for a couple minutes. And the point of whisking the ingredients together, whisking the wet ingredients together, is just to incorporate everything. So making sure that you're breaking up the egg, there are no lumps from the pumpkin puree, and that everything is nice, and you kind of just want it to be one consistency. Next, we're going to be on step number 5, which is pouring the wet ingredients over the dry ingredients. And then we're going to kind of try to mix it and incorporate everything together until a bit of a ball forms, but it's going to be pretty loose. So you just want it to kind of be able to pull away from the edges. And we don't want to over mix it or over knead it or anything. So we'll kind of gently mix it all together. And then we're going to be dumping it onto the counter after. We're done with the whisk now, so you can shake it off and again, keep your workspace clean. I'll just put it off in the sink for now. And if everyone's good to go to the next step, I'm pouring my wet ingredients just over my dry ingredients now. And by now, you should have lots of pumpkin smells. So you should be able to smell the pumpkin puree. You should be able to smell the pumpkin spice. It's going to be a very strong smell. All right, so make sure you get it all in there. And then I'm going to put my dirty bowl in the sink over there. And then just kind of start mixing it, start from the outside. Make sure to incorporate the flour from underneath. You want all of the flour being incorporated. And it might look a little bit dry at first. I found that this looks kind of dry when I make it originally. But as we dump it onto the counter, you'll notice that there are a lot of clumps that are still wet. And we can always adjust the ingredients as we go. My surface right now is coated in flour. Might be hard to see on the camera, but give your counter a few good flicks of flour. And then you can move the flour over to the side. Okay, so now's the part where we're going to start using our hands. And then we'll transfer the dough onto a floured surface. We'll work the dough into a ball and press flat about 2 inches thick, and then we're going to cut it into 8 equal wedges. So I'm going to get both my hands in my bowl, and I'm going to scoop from the bottom, making sure to incorporate all the flour. And again, it might be easy to get excited and want to just grab it all and mix it all together, but you don't want to over knead it, you don't want to overwork it, And this step, usually you don't want to take too long to do it because we don't want the butter to get too warm and melt into smaller pieces. We're trying to keep bigger chunks. So my dough is looking a little bit cracked, like it's not all one consistency, but I'm gonna dump it out onto the counter anyways. I'm gonna move my bowl off to the side. And I'm gonna start bringing it together to form a ball. So you just want it to form a circle. Nice and easy. Just like, I would say maybe it looks like a baseball, probably about the size of a baseball, just working it with your hands. There are a few different ways to do this. Some recipes ask that you use a rolling pin. We're not gonna use a rolling pin. We're gonna keep it nice and easy and just use our hands. And I'm just gonna press it flat. I would say it's about the size of a dinner plate. Like I mentioned, we're gonna want to cut it into 8 equal wedges, about 2 inches thick. Mine is probably about 1 inch thick. It's not very thick, but just remember when you put the scones in the oven, they do rise. And so mine's flat in a circle now. I'm just gonna move over to the sink and take all the extra dough off my hands. And once you have all the dough off your hands, you can take your just a butter knife to cut the scones into 8 equal pieces. And now is the time when we can grab our baking sheets that we've already prepared. If you haven't prepared them yet, feel free to do it now. I think we're just gonna need one. I'm just gonna grab one and bring it over here. On the top of your dough, if you see cracks, mine has a few cracks. Don't worry about that. They're not meant to all look the same, and they're all gonna taste great. Now we're on step 7. And step 7 is place the scones onto prepared baking sheets, and then we're gonna bake for 15 minutes. So I'm gonna use this knife. It's not a very sharp knife, it's pretty dull. You might even actually want to put a bit of flour on it because the scones are gonna be a little bit sticky. So I'm gonna grab a little bit more flour. And just sprinkle it on, just enough to coat it. And then I'm moving my flour back over. And to cut this circle, if you haven't started yet, you can follow along with me now. First, we're gonna cut it in half, and then we're gonna cut it into quarters. So go ahead and do that. And you can do this just with a butter knife. I would be careful if you're using a sharper knife. You might need some adult supervision for this part. And you don't need to press too hard. We want to cut just gently enough for them to pull away. So that way we're not compressing the layers because we want the layers to be there. That's kind of what makes the scone. We want the pockets of butter. So we have 4 quarters, and I'm going to cut each one in half once more, making 8. And yours might all be different sizes. They can all look different, and that's totally fine because mine definitely don't all look the same. But they are all going to taste good. One thing I would suggest is try to cut into equal sizes just because smaller ones won't take as long to bake as bigger ones. So as long as they're all roughly the same size, it's going to make it a lot easier to bake them all together. And I'm going to just go ahead and place mine on my baking tray with parchment paper. Making sure to space them out a little bit. 8 scones isn't too much, so you shouldn't have an issue. If you have a bit of a smaller baking tray, you might need to, but leave a little bit of space because they are going to rise. So I'm going to go ahead and pop these in the oven quickly. And if you can with your oven, try to place them in the center, as central as possible. That way they're going to bake evenly. It says to bake them for 15 minutes. These are potentially going to take a little bit longer. They might take around 20. So we want to bake them until they start to get a little bit brown on top and until you press your finger in and it springs back. In the meantime, while we're waiting for those to finish, we're going to make the icing that we're going to put on top. And for the icing, you'll need 4 ingredients. It's pretty simple. We're going to use powdered sugar, milk. I'm going to be using the cream that we used earlier. and then pumpkin puree and pumpkin spice. So all ingredients that we used before. The only one that's different is the powdered sugar. And that's the same as the other sugar that we used. It's just blended up to a finer powder. So when you have a chance, just grab a small bowl, place it down on the counter in front of you, and we're just going to be measuring out the ingredients and whisking them together. So I'm going to start out with 1 cup of powdered sugar. And it doesn't have to be perfectly level. I just get it around to the top and dump that in your bowl. Then we're going to do 2 tablespoons of milk. I'm going to be using cream. And don't quite put that away. I would keep it just by you, just in case we need to adjust and add more liquid in if our icing is too hard. 1 tablespoon of pumpkin puree. Dump that in the bowl. And then a teaspoon of our pumpkin pie spice. And again, this is just going to give it a really rich flavor. I'm measuring out 1 teaspoon. Dump that in. And then you're going to take the whisk that you were using earlier and whisk the ingredients together. Okay, so mine is looking very, very dry. So I'm going to bang my whisk off, and then I'm actually going to add a couple more tablespoons. This can vary depending on what yours may look like. It might look really different. I'm just going to add probably 2 more tablespoons of milk. Let's give it a mix. It's pretty thick, but it does drop off the whisk when I hold it up. So just whisk it a little bit more and make sure you get rid of any clumps. Make sure you're careful when you open the oven and you're taking them out. Wear oven mitts. They help to not burn your hands. You might need help from an adult. But I'm going to go ahead and take mine out now. You can see the tops are a little bit brown. They spring up when I poke them. And so I'm just going to place them on the counter here. And then putting the icing on to do is, it's nice while they're still warm because the icing will kind of fall over the sides and it will kind of give it a nice look. So I'm going to take about a tablespoon. Again, the measurement doesn't really matter for how much, it just depends how much icing you want. And I'm just going to put it on, spread it evenly over the scone. Then I'm just going to do that on every scone. Again, a good tip, it's better to start with less icing and make sure you can evenly spread it on all scones. If you start with more, you might run out by the end and then you might have a few scones that are without icing. If your scones are out of the oven and they're all done, now is a perfect time to turn your oven off, which I'm going to do quickly. Let me tell you, the icing is delicious. I've made these scones before and they're so good, and I think the icing makes it. It makes them nice and moist. They're really good. And some of these are going to be heaping with icing, which I think is going to make them pretty delicious. All right. And those are our pumpkin scones. If you want to learn more about pumpkins, we have the Story of Food, which is featuring pumpkins, on our website, just under the Story of Food, under October. And you can learn all about pumpkins. You can play the activities. There's jokes in there. Learn where they come from. And thank you for coming, everybody, and I hope to see you next week.